The lanterns were wrong. Alara Maddox noticed it the moment she stepped off the transit shuttle and into the festival of returning lights on Tessavra Prime. Every lamppost along the cobblestone promenade carried a globe of bioluminescent gel, the Tessavri way of celebrating the spring equinox, but they were hung too high. The adult Tessavri who had strung them stood over 2 meters tall, slender as birch trees, and they had placed each lantern at their own eye level, comfortable for them. Invisible to the 37 children watching from behind the orphanage fence at the end of the street. The children pressed against the iron bars with their faces tilted up, trying to see the glow. None of them were tall enough. The smallest ones had given up and were sitting in the dust of the courtyard, listening to the festival music drifting over the wall. Alara set her travel case down on the cobblestones. She had come 14,000 light-years for a single semester, 12 standard weeks, as part of the Galactic Educators Exchange. Teach basic interspecies literacy at a Tessavri youth facility, file the cultural exchange report, go home. That was the contract. That was all. She looked at the children behind the fence, and something pulled tight in her chest. One of them looked back. A girl, small even by Tessavri child standards, with lavender skin and white hair cropped unevenly above her pointed ears. Her eyes were a pale mint green, too large for her face, and they held the particular stillness that Alara had learned to recognize across 4 postings on 3 different worlds. Not fear, not sadness, just the absence of expectation, the look of a child who had stopped waiting for anything good. The girl's fingers were laced through the iron bars. She was not watching the lanterns. She was watching Alara. "You're the human," a voice said behind her. Alara turned. A Tessavri administrator stood on the promenade, tall and angular, his gray-blue skin catching the festival light. His name was Protector Warden Kale, and he managed the Anchuret orphan house. He did not offer his hand. Tessavri did not touch strangers. "Alara Maddox," she said. "I'm your exchange teacher." Kale looked at her the way one might look at a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. "You are smaller than I expected." "Most humans are." "The semester begins tomorrow. You will teach literacy and numeracy to the older cohort, those capable of instruction. The younger ones are in custodial care only. They are not your concern." He turned and began walking toward the orphanage gate. "The festival ends at moonrise. The children will be brought inside before then." Alara picked up her case and followed. As she passed the gate, she glanced down. The lavender girl was still there, fingers still on the bars, those mint-green eyes still tracking her with the patience of someone who had learned to watch everything and expect nothing. "What's her name?" Alara asked. Kale did not slow down. "Designation Mivra 4. She is in the younger cohort. She is not your concern." The door to the orphanage closed behind them, and Alara heard, very faintly through the stone walls, the festival music playing for a city of adults who had hung their lanterns too high. The Anchuret orphan house had been built for a different purpose. The walls were thick quarried stone from the cliffs above the city, originally cut for a grain storehouse 3 centuries ago. The corridors were wide enough for Tessavri adults to pass without touching, a species requirement Alara would learn the significance of over time, but the ceilings were low by their standards, which meant they were merely tall by hers. The dormitories held 6 cots each, arranged with geometric precision, and the common room had a single window that faced the inner courtyard. The children ate in silence. This was the first thing Alara noticed when she sat in on the evening meal that first night, a festival day supper of cold grain cakes and reconstituted broth. 37 children, ages ranging from what Alara estimated as 4 to 14 in human equivalent years, eating without a word. No arguments over portions. No laughter. No complaints. The older ones watched the younger ones with a steady, adult attentiveness that made Alara's throat ache, and the younger ones ate with the focused efficiency of creatures who had learned that meals were not guaranteed. Mivra 4 sat at the end of the farthest table. She ate half her grain cake, wrapped the other half in a scrap of cloth, and slipped it into the pocket of her threadbare tunic. When she caught Alara watching, she went very still, the way a small animal goes still when a shadow passes over it. Alara looked away. She finished her own meal and carried her tray to the washing station. The first week was a negotiation with Stone. Cale had assigned her a classroom on the second floor, a former counting room with a single chalkboard, 12 stools, and no teaching materials beyond a box of worn styluses, and a stack of language primers printed in a Tessevri dialect that 3 of her 12 students did not speak. The older cohort ranged from 10 to 14 equivalent years, and they watched Alara with the careful blankness of children who had been taught by a rotating cast of temporary instructors, exchange workers, volunteer clergy, board civil service assignees completing mandatory community hours, none of whom had stayed longer than a season. "My name is Alara," she said on the first morning, writing it on the board in both Galactic Standard and Tessevri script. "I'm going to be your teacher." Silence. "I'm here for 1 semester, 12 weeks. During that time I want to." "The last one said 8 weeks, a boy named Torin interrupted. He was the oldest, nearly as tall as Alara, with gray skin and sharp amber eyes. "She left after 3. "The one before her said a full year," added a girl named Pesali, who sat in the back with her arms crossed. "She left after 9 days. Alara set down the chalk. "How many teachers have you had?" The children looked at each other. Torin counted on his fingers. 11 in 6 years. 12, corrected a small voice. Mivra 4 was sitting in the doorway. She was not part of the older cohort. She was not supposed to be there. She held her knees against her chest and looked at Alara with those mint-green eyes. "You forgot the one who came on the holiday and left before the meal." "She doesn't count," Torin said. "She came," Mivra 4 said quietly. "She counted." Cale appeared in the corridor and ushered Mivra 4 away with a sharp word. Alara watched her go, that small lavender figure disappearing down the stone hallway, and then turned back to her class. 11 teachers in 6 years, she said. "What did any of them teach you?" The silence that followed was the most honest answer she had ever received. She threw away the lesson plan. The primers were useless, printed for native Tessevri speakers, full of cultural references the orphans did not share because they had grown up inside these walls, not in the wider world. So Alara started with what was real. She brought objects from the marketplace, a fruit with a thick rind, a mechanic's wrench borrowed from the maintenance shed, a festival lantern she bought from a street vendor. "Tell me what this is," she said, holding up the fruit. "A cormelon," Pesali said. "Good, write it." She waited while they scratched the Tessevri characters. "Now tell me what it weighs, what it smells like, whether you'd eat it or throw it at someone you didn't like." Pesali smiled. It was the first smile Alara had seen in the building. By the end of the second week, the older cohort was writing sentences. Not just writing them, fighting over them. Torin and Pesali argued for 10 minutes about whether the stone walls of the orphanage were gray or blue, and Alara let them argue because that was the point. They were noticing the world. They were forming opinions about the world. They were using words to defend those opinions, and for children who had spent years in institutional silence, this was not a classroom exercise. It was an awakening. A boy named Drell, who had not spoken a voluntary word to any adult in 2 years, wrote a sentence about the stars he could see from the dormitory window at night. The sentence was 4 words long. "Stars are always there." He showed it to Alara with the expression of someone offering a fragile thing, and Alara read it and said, "Yes, they are." He wrote 6 more sentences that week. By the end of the 3rd week, they were writing paragraphs, short, clumsy, raw accounts of their days, their dormitories, the view from the single window. Torin wrote about the sound the building made at night, a low groan in the stone that he said was the house breathing. Pesali wrote about the marketplace she could see from the roof, if she climbed the maintenance ladder that Kale did not know she could reach. Drell wrote about a dream he had where the walls of the orphanage turned into glass and he could see everything outside. And Alara hung it on the classroom wall because it was the bravest thing anyone had written. Kale noticed the paragraphs on the wall during an inspection. He stood in the doorway and read them, everyone, from Torrin's stone-groaning house to Drell's glass walls, and then he looked at Alara. "The previous teachers used the primers," he said. "The previous teachers left." He said nothing else, but he did not take the paragraphs down. And every morning, without fail, Mivra 4 appeared in the doorway. She never entered the classroom. She sat on the corridor floor with her knees pulled up and listened. Sometimes she had the wrapped half-cake in her pocket. Sometimes she had nothing. She never spoke unless spoken to, and she flinched whenever Kale's footsteps echoed in the hall. On the fourth week, Alara brought an extra stool into the classroom and set it by the door, half in the corridor, half in the room. Mivra 4 looked at it. "It's there if you want it," Alara said, and went back to the lesson. Mivra 4 sat on it. She did not cross the threshold into the classroom for another 11 days, and when she finally did, sliding the stool forward 1 inch at a time over the course of a morning, Alara did not comment. Neither did the older children. They had been watching, too. The first letter came at the end of week 5. It was from the Galactic Educators Exchange, and it was a form letter, the kind generated by a system that processed 10,000 postings a year and personalized none of them. It informed Alara that her semester assignment at Anshuret Orphan House was nearing its midpoint, and that she should begin preparing her cultural exchange report for submission upon departure. Alara read it at her desk in the small room they had given her, a converted storage closet with a cot, a shelf, and a window that overlooked the inner courtyard. From the window, she could see the children's evening routine, the older ones herding the younger ones toward the washing stations, the younger ones resisting with the universal determination of children who did not want to wash. She could see Mivra 4 sitting alone in the corner of the courtyard, her back against the wall, that half-cake in her hands. She was not eating it, she was holding it. Alara closed the letter and did not begin the report. The trouble started in week 6. A Tesevri trade delegation from the northern provinces arrived in the city for the Seasonal Commerce Summit, and they needed lodging. The municipal authority, a body of elected officials who managed Tesavra Prime's civil infrastructure, looked at the available buildings and identified the Anshuret Orphan House as an underutilized public facility that could be temporarily repurposed. Kale delivered the news to Alara in the corridor outside the classroom, his voice flat in the way of someone who had received orders he could not refuse. "The children will be transferred to the district holding facility on the outer ring. It is a temporary measure. The summit lasts 20 days. "A holding facility," Alara said. "A processing center, it is adequate." I've seen processing centers, she had. On Kureth 7, during her second posting, she had visited a juvenile processing center and found 40 children in a room designed for 12, sleeping on the floor, eating 1 meal a day, supervised by a single guard who did not know their names. How long has this been planned? The directive was issued this morning. And the children, have they been told? They will be informed this evening. Alara looked at him, this tall, angular man who had managed the orphanage for 9 years with the dispassionate efficiency of a warehouse supervisor. He was not cruel. She had come to understand that about Kale. He was not kind either. He was a functionary operating inside a system that had no category for the thing the children needed, and he had long since stopped trying to provide it. 20 days in a processing center, she said, for 37 children, because a trade delegation needs a place to sleep. The alternative is non-compliance with a municipal directive. The consequences of noncompliance include closure of the facility and permanent dispersal of the wards. I have seen this happen. He paused. You have 6 weeks remaining in your contract. You could return early. The exchange will not penalize an incomplete semester if the host facility is disrupted. I'm not leaving. Kale studied her with an expression she could not read. The shuttle to the outer ring departs tomorrow at dawn. Alara spent that evening in the courtyard. She sat on the ground with her back against the same wall where Mivra 4 usually sat, and she did something that 12 weeks of training had told her not to do. She let the children come to her. They came slowly, the way the tide comes in, first Torin, who leaned against the wall 3 feet away and said nothing. Then Pesali, who sat cross-legged and asked if the new place would have a window. Then the younger ones, in 2s and 3s, pulling their blankets around their shoulders against the evening chill, settling in a loose half-circle that nobody had organized but everybody understood. Mivra 4 came last. She sat closer to Alara than she had ever sat to anyone, close enough that Alara could see the faint iridescence in her lavender skin, the almost imperceptible tremor in her small hands. She did not speak. She placed her half-cake on the ground between them, and after a moment she slid it 1 inch toward Alara. It was the most valuable thing she owned, and she was offering it. Alara did not pick it up. She placed her hand on the ground next to it, palm up, and waited. After a long time, 3 minutes, 5, 7, Mivra 4 placed her small fingers in Alara's palm. The touch was electric. Tesevri children, Alara had learned, did not initiate physical contact with strangers. It was a biological and cultural threshold so fundamental that Kale had listed it in the orientation materials as a behavior that should never be forced. The child chose, or the child did not choose. There was no middle ground. Mivra 4 had chosen. "Are you going to leave?" the girl asked. It was the first time she had spoken directly to Alara outside the classroom. "No," Alara said. "The others all left." "I know." "If you leave," Mivra 4 said and stopped. Her fingers tightened. "If you leave, I will understand." Something in Alara's chest broke cleanly in 2. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not tomorrow, not in 6 weeks, I'm not leaving." The holding facility on the outer ring was exactly as bad as she had expected. It was a converted customs warehouse at the edge of the spaceport, a vast, echoing space with prefabricated partition walls that did not reach the ceiling, fluorescent panels that buzzed day and night, and a processing desk staffed by a single clerk who looked at the 37 children with the expression of someone who had been told to expect cargo. "Cohort ID?" the clerk asked. "They have names," Alara said. The clerk blinked. "Cohort ID." Alara gave it. The children were assigned a section, 4 partitioned areas, 9 to 10 children each, with cots, a shared washing station, and a meal slot that dispensed the same reconstituted broth twice a day. There was no classroom. There was no courtyard. There were no windows. "I need a space to teach," Alara told the facility manager, a bored Tesevri official named Duran who managed the warehouse the way one manages a warehouse. "This is a holding facility, not a school. These are children, not freight." Duran looked at her for a long time. "You can use the loading dock. It's empty between shifts." The loading dock was a concrete platform open to the sky on one side, overlooking the spaceport landing pads. It was loud. Shuttles arrived and departed at intervals, shaking the ground, and it was exposed to the weather. It was also the only space in the facility with natural light. Alara set up class on the loading dock. She had no chalkboard, no styluses, no primers. She used a piece of broken conduit as a pointer and scratched letters into the concrete with a stone. The older cohort sat on overturned cargo crates. Mivra 4 sat on the edge of the dock with her feet dangling over the side, watching the ships. "Today," Alara said, "we're going to write letters." "To who?" Torin asked. To anyone. Pick someone you've never met, someone you want to exist, and write them a letter. Tell them what you see from here. The children wrote. On scraps of packing paper, on the backs of customs forms Ilara had salvaged from a recycling bin, on the concrete itself. Pesali wrote to a sister she had invented, a girl her own age who lived on a planet with oceans, which Pesali had never seen. Torin wrote to his future self, 10 years from now, asking whether the nights were still loud. Mivra 4 did not write a letter. She drew a picture, a small figure standing next to a larger figure, both of them looking at a sky full of festival lanterns hung at the right height. On the third day at the holding facility, one of the younger children stopped eating. His name was Phenol. He was 5 equivalent years, gray-skinned and quiet, and he had been at the Anchuret house since he was an infant. He sat on his cot in the partitioned section with his meal tray untouched in front of him, and stared at the partition wall with an expression that Ilara recognized from her second posting, the look of a child who was shutting down from the inside. Ilara sat beside him. Phenol. Nothing. You need to eat. He turned his head slowly. The walls don't have windows. No. The old place had a window. I know. I want to see outside. His voice was flat, already older than it should have been. I want to know if it's daytime. Ilara carried him to the loading dock. She held him on her hip. He was light, lighter than he should have been, all bones and angles, and she showed him the sky. It was mid-morning, bright and clear, with cargo shuttles crossing the blue like slow-moving fish. It's daytime, she said. Tomorrow too. Tomorrow too. She carried him back and he ate. But the next morning she found 2 more children who would not leave their cots, and by the 5th day, the younger cohort had stopped playing entirely. They sat in the partitioned sections with the focused stillness of creatures conserving energy, and when Ilara knelt beside them, they looked at her with eyes that asked the same question Phenol had asked. How long? Durin noticed. The facility manager appeared on the loading dock during the 7th-day lesson, his arms folded, watching Ilara scratch letters into the concrete while a shuttle shook the platform beneath them. The younger ones are deteriorating, he said. I've logged it with the municipal authority. What did they say? They acknowledged receipt. He paused. That is what they always say. And then nothing. The delegation needs the building. The children need a building. The delegation's needs are funded. The children's needs are not. The arithmetic is simple. The arithmetic is wrong. Durin looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, the ghost of a principle he had buried under years of warehouse management. I did not say I agreed with it. On the 8th day at the holding facility, the municipal authority extended the trade summit by 15 days. Kale delivered the news by comlink. His voice was careful. The delegation has requested an extension. The orphan house will not be available for 35 days total, possibly longer. And the children remain where they are. Ilara stood on the loading dock and watched a cargo shuttle lift off in a column of heat and noise. Mivra 4 was beside her, sitting with her knees drawn up. The girl had not been sleeping. Ilara could see it in the shadows under her eyes, the way she held herself, tight, controlled, braced. The walls are too close, Mivra 4 said quietly. At night the partitions move. They don't move. I know, but they feel like they do. Ilara knelt. She did it without thinking, dropped to one knee on the concrete so her eyes were level with the girl's. I'm going to fix this, she said. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to fix it. You can't, Mivra 4 said. You're one person. One person is all it takes sometimes. The girl looked at her with those mint-green eyes, and for the first time, there was something in them that might have been the beginning of belief. Ilara started making calls. The Galactic Educators Exchange had a complaints procedure that ran through 7 layers of bureaucracy, and took a minimum of 90 days to process. The municipal authority had an appeals process that required a registered TESEVRY citizen to file, which Alara was not. The facility manager, Duran, was sympathetic in the abstract and useless in practice. Kale was bound by the directive and would not risk the orphanage's operating license by challenging it. Every door was closed, every path ran into a wall. On the 14th day, Alara found a different kind of door. Her name was Seleth Vorn, and she was a retired TESEVRY circuit judge who lived in the old quarter of the city. Alara found her the way she found most things, by asking the right question to the wrong person. She had gone to the marketplace to buy food for the children. The holding facility's meal rations were inadequate, and she was spending her own salary to supplement them. And she had mentioned to a fruit vendor that she was looking for someone who understood TESEVRY child welfare law. The vendor had laughed. "You want Seleth. Everyone wants Seleth. She'll tell you the law and then she'll tell you it doesn't matter because nobody enforces it." Seleth Vorn was 97 years old by TESEVRY reckoning, which put her somewhere in the neighborhood of a vigorous 70 by human standards. She was small for her species, barely taller than Alara, with deep blue skin that had faded to the color of old denim and eyes like black river stones. She sat in a courtyard garden behind her house, drinking tea from a clay cup that she had made herself, and she listened to Alara's account of the situation with the stillness of a person who had heard 1,000 similar stories. "The Anchurit children," she said when Alara finished. "I know that facility. I inspected it 11 years ago. The walls were adequate, the care was not. It's worse now. They've been moved to a customs warehouse." "For a trade delegation," Seleth sipped her tea. "Tell me, why are you still here?" "I'm their teacher." "You are a temporary exchange worker on a 12-week contract. You have no legal standing, no custodial authority, and no leverage. Why are you still here?" Alara looked at this old woman, this retired judge who had spent a career inside a system that processed children like inventory, and said the only true thing she knew. "Because I told a girl I wouldn't leave." Seleth set down her tea. She looked at Alara for a long time, and something shifted in those dark eyes, something that might have been recognition, or memory, or the particular pain of someone who had once made the same promise and learned what it cost. "There is a provision," she said. "Article 14 of the TESEVRY Child Welfare Code. It has never been invoked because nobody has ever been foolish enough to try. It allows a registered caregiver to petition for emergency relocation of displaced minors to any approved facility, or, in the absence of one, to temporary private custody under the caregiver's own recognizance." "I'm not a registered caregiver." "No, but the exchange credential gives you a provisional teaching license, which, under Article 14, subsection 6, can be elevated to emergency caregiver status by any sitting or retired judicial officer." She paused. "Such as myself." "Would the municipal authority honor it?" Seleth smiled. It was a thin, sharp smile, the smile of a woman who had spent a lifetime inside the law and knew exactly where its seams were. "They would have to. Article 14 predates the municipal charter. It cannot be overridden by a directive." "Then do it." "You understand what this means. Emergency custody of 37 children. You would be personally responsible for their welfare, their housing, their feeding. If anything happens to any of them, it falls on you." "I understand." "You understand that your 12-week contract will be meaningless. Emergency custody has no expiration date. It terminates only when the children are returned to an approved facility or when you voluntarily relinquish it." "I understand." Seleth studied her. "You are either very brave or very foolish." "I'm a teacher," Alara said. "It's usually both." The paperwork took 3 days. Seleth drafted it herself, longhand on formal judicial parchment, with citations so precise and language so airtight that the municipal clerk who processed it read it twice, looked up at Alara and said, "This is real. It's real. You're taking custody of all of them. Every one." The clerk stamped it. The next problem was housing. The orphan house was still occupied by the trade delegation, and Alara had no alternative facility. What she had was a network of connections she had built over 6 weeks of buying fruit, borrowing tools, and talking to every vendor, mechanic, and retired civil servant in the marketplace district. The fruit vendor, whose name was Perrin, offered the empty apartment above his shop. It had 2 rooms and a leaking roof. A mechanic named Dastra, who had fixed the orphanage's water heater 3 times and been paid once, offered the use of her workshop's back room on weekends. A retired schoolteacher named Vas Tesevry, 80 years old, who had taught in the state schools for 40 years before being discarded by the same system that discarded the children, heard about Alara through Seleth, and appeared at the holding facility with a box of proper teaching supplies, and a look on her face that said she had been waiting for someone to ask. "I can teach mathematics," Voss said, "and Tesevry literature, and I can reach the high shelves." "Can you cook?" "Adequately." "You're hired, I can't pay you." "I did not ask to be paid." It took 4 days to move the children. Alara organized it like a military operation, groups of 8, escorted through the city streets by Alara, Voss, and Perrin, who closed his fruit stall for the day and carried 3 sleeping toddlers in his arms without being asked. The apartment above the fruit shop was too small for 37 children. It was also warm, and it had windows, and Perrin had strung a line of festival lanterns across the ceiling at exactly the height where the smallest child could reach up and touch the glow. The first night was chaos. 37 children in 2 rooms meant sleeping in shifts, blankets overlapping, the younger ones stacked like cordwood on improvised bedding. Alara slept on the kitchen floor with her back against the wall and her feet touching the doorframe. At 3 in the morning, she felt a small body press against her side, Fenal, who had crossed the room in the dark and curled up against her without waking. She put her arm around him and stayed awake until dawn. The 3rd day, a rhythm emerged. Voss took the morning lessons in the back room of Dastra's workshop, while Alara ran the afternoon sessions in the apartment. Perrin supplied fruit and grain from his stall at cost, then below cost, then for free when Alara's salary ran out. Dastra rewired the apartment's heating system on her lunch break and refused to send a bill. Seleth sent a crate of books from her personal library with a note that said, "Return them when the children have outgrown them." The children bloomed. There was no other word for it. Torin, who had not voluntarily spoken to an adult in 3 years, began helping Perrin stack crates in the morning before lessons. Pesali wrote her first complete essay, a 4-page account of the holding facility that was so precise in its fury and so measured in its language that Seleth, when she read it, looked up and said, "This girl has a future in law." Fenal started eating again. He ate everything. He ate with the specific determination of a child who had decided that the world might, after all, be worth staying in. And Mivra 4 touched a lantern. She held her fingers against the warm gel for a long time, and then she looked at Alara with an expression that Alara would remember for the rest of her life. Not joy, not gratitude, but something quieter and more durable. The beginning of safety. "You came back for us," the girl said. "I never left." The 12 weeks ended. Alara's contract expired. The Galactic Educators Exchange sent a final notice, a travel voucher for the return shuttle, and a form requesting her cultural exchange report. She filed the report. It was 3 pages long. The first page described the orphanage. The second page described the holding facility. The third page described what she had done about it, and it ended with a single sentence: "I am not returning." The exchange processed the report, flagged her file as non-returning voluntary, and moved on to the next temporary teacher in the next temporary posting. Alara stayed. The trade delegation left after 41 days. The orphan house was returned to its original purpose, but by then, something had changed. The children had lived for 5 weeks in an apartment above a fruit shop with a human teacher who slept on the floor, a retired Tess-Every school teacher who reached the high shelves, and a fruit vendor who made sure nobody was hungry. They had written letters and drawn pictures, and learned to read by the light of festival lanterns hung at the right height. They did not want to go back to the stone building with the low ceilings and the single window. Seleth Vorn, who had been watching from her courtyard garden with the patience of a woman who had spent a career waiting for the law to catch up with justice, filed a second petition. This one requested a permanent restructuring of the Ansharet orphan house's administrative framework, replacing the rotating teacher model with a permanent resident educator position, and nominating Alara Maddox for the role. The municipal authority debated it for 3 weeks. Cale testified not for Alara, but not against her. He said in his flat, bureaucratic way that the facility's operational metrics had improved measurably during the human's tenure, and that the children's behavioral indicators were within acceptable parameters. Seleth translated, "He means they're eating, he means they're sleeping, he means they've started talking." The petition was approved. The first year was survival. Alara rebuilt the classroom from scratch, proper materials, proper curriculum, lessons designed for children who had grown up inside walls and needed to learn about the world outside them. She took the older cohort on walks through the city, teaching them to navigate streets they had only seen through the fence. She brought the younger ones to the marketplace, where Perrin let them touch the fruit and Dastra let them watch her fix engines, and Voss taught them the names of things in 3 languages. But survival had teeth. 6 months in, a municipal health inspector arrived at the orphan house unannounced and cited 7 violations: insufficient sanitation facilities, overcrowded dormitories, expired medical supplies. The violations were real. The building was 3 centuries old and had never been properly maintained. Cale had been filing maintenance requests for 9 years and receiving the same response: acknowledged, unfunded, deferred. The inspector gave them 60 days to comply or face closure. Alara did not panic. She made a list. She prioritized. She went to Dastra, who looked at the list and said, "I can fix 4 of these. The plumbing, you need a professional." "I can't afford a professional." "I know a plumber. She owes me for a transmission rebuild." The plumber, a broad-shouldered Tess-Every woman named Keth who swore constantly and worked with terrifying efficiency, arrived the next morning and replumbed 2 dormitory washrooms in 3 days. She charged nothing. When Alara asked why, Keth looked at the children eating breakfast in the common room and said, "My sister grew up in a place like this. Nobody fixed anything for her either." The inspector returned on day 58. He walked through the building with his clipboard, checking each item, and when he reached the end of his list, he looked at Alara with an expression she had learned to recognize: the particular discomfort of a bureaucrat confronted with someone who had done the work. "Compliant," he said, and left. Mivra 4 learned to read in 4 months. She was ferociously intelligent, the kind of mind that grabbed hold of a concept and did not let go until it was understood from every angle. She read everything Alara gave her, and then read things Alara had not given her, borrowing books from Seleth's personal library and returning them with questions that the retired judge said were better than most of the arguments she had heard in court. "This child," Seleth told Alara over tea in the courtyard garden, "is not ordinary. None of them are." "That is a kind thing to say. I mean something more specific. She processes information the way a judicial mind does, systematically, relentlessly, with an instinct for the gap between what is said and what is meant. She will be something if she is given the chance." "Then we give her the chance." The 3rd year, A contagion swept through the district. Velspor, a fungal infection that affected Tesevry lungs, harmless to adults but dangerous to children. The municipal health authority quarantined the orphanage for 3 weeks. Ilara, who was immune by virtue of being human, was the only caretaker allowed inside. 3 weeks, 32 children, 1 human. She slept in 2-hour increments, rotating between dormitories. She administered medication on the schedule Seleth's physician had prescribed. She held Fenal's hand when his breathing went shallow at 4 in the morning, and stayed with him until dawn broke and his chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of a child who was going to make it. Mivra, who was 8 equivalent years and already reading at an adult level, organized the older children into a care rotation. She assigned tasks, water distribution, meal preparation, temperature monitoring, with the quiet authority of someone who had learned from watching Ilara that the answer to an overwhelming problem was to break it into pieces small enough for steady hands. Nobody died. When the quarantine lifted and Voss and Kale returned, they found the dormitories clean, the children fed, and Ilara asleep on the floor of the common room with Fenal's head on her knee. Kale stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long time before he turned and walked away without saying anything at all. The 4th year, Torin aged out of the orphanage system. He was 18 equivalent years, legally an adult under Tesevry law, and the system's obligation to him ended the moment the calendar turned. He stood in the courtyard on his last morning with a small bag of belongings and the expression of someone stepping off a cliff. Ilara gave him a letter. She had written it on proper paper, sealed it, and addressed it to a freight company in the port district whose owner owed Dostru a favor. "It's an apprenticeship offer," she said. "Room and board included. You start on Monday." Torin looked at the letter. He looked at Ilara. His jaw worked. "You did this," he said. "Dostru did this?" I asked. Nobody ever asked. He left that morning, and 6 months later he sent a message to the orphanage, the first message any former resident had ever sent back. It said, "I am learning to build things. The ceilings are high here." Pesali followed him within the year, then 2 more. Then 3. Ilara built a network of apprenticeships, scholarships, placement agreements with businesses and schools across the district, each one negotiated personally, each one anchored by the same simple argument: these children can learn and they deserve the chance. Not every placement worked. 2 children came back, one after a failed apprenticeship, another after a family that had agreed to foster her changed their minds. Ilara took them back without questions and without blame, and she found new placements, and she kept going. Year 6, a child named Seret ran away. She was 11 equivalent years, pale-skinned and angular, and she had been at the Anchoret house for 3 years, long enough to trust the routine, not long enough to trust it completely. She disappeared during a marketplace trip, slipping away from the group while Voss was counting heads, and by the time anyone noticed, she had a 30-minute head start and a city of 200,000 people to vanish into. Ilara did not panic. She assigned Voss to take the remaining children back to the orphanage, and then she started walking. She knew Seret. That was the advantage of being the teacher who stayed. She knew what each child feared, what they wanted, and where they went when the world pressed too hard. Seret had written a paragraph, months ago, about a park she had seen through the orphanage fence, a green space with tall trees and a fountain where city children played after school. She had described it with the precision of someone who had memorized every detail from a distance. Ilara found the park. She found Seret sitting on a bench near the fountain, watching the city children play with the same stillness that Mivra 4 had once used to watch the festival lanterns, the stillness of someone outside the fence. She sat down beside her. "I wanted to see it up close," Seret said. "And it's smaller than I thought." She looked at Ilara. "Are you going to be angry?" "No. Kale will be angry." Kale will be worried. That looks like anger in his species, but it isn't. Sarek considered this. Can we stay for a few more minutes? Alara stayed. They watched the fountain together, and after a while Sarek said, "The children here have parents who pick them up." Yes. What is that like? It's like someone being there every morning, Alara said, so reliably that you stop noticing it. Sarek looked at her with an expression that was too old for her face. I notice. I know you do. They walked back to the orphanage together, and Sarek did not run again. 2 years later, she was placed with a Tessevry family in the northern district, a couple who had lost their own child to the Velspor outbreak and who had written to Alara asking if there was a girl who needed a home. Alara introduced them to Sarek, and Sarek looked at them and looked at Alara and said, "Will you still be at the orphanage if I need to come back?" "I'll be there," Alara said. Sarek went. She did not come back. But she wrote every month in the careful handwriting that Alara had taught her, letters that always ended the same way. I am fine. The ceilings are normal. There are 2 windows. Fenal was the one who surprised everyone. The gray-skinned boy who had stopped eating in the holding facility, who had asked Alara if tomorrow would be daytime too, turned out to have hands that understood machines the way Mivra's mind understood law. Dostra noticed it first. She let him watch her rebuild a transit engine, and within an hour he was handing her tools before she asked for them, anticipating the sequence with an instinct that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with a mind that saw how pieces fit together. He reads engines the way some people read faces, Dostra told Alara. Keep him in school. I'll take him when he's ready. The years stacked up 5, 6, 7. The city changed. The marketplace expanded. Perrin retired and his daughter took over the fruit stall. Dostra's workshop became a proper training facility. Voss kept teaching until her hands could no longer hold the chalk, and then she sat in the classroom and taught from memory, and the children listened because her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime believing that knowledge was the one thing that could not be taken from you. Mivra 4 grew. She shed the designation, Alara never used it, and gradually nobody else did either. She became simply Mivra, and then, as she entered adolescence, she became the girl who read everything, argued about everything, and cared about everything with an intensity that sometimes made Alara catch her breath. "Why did you stay?" Mivra asked one evening. They were sitting in the courtyard, the orphanage courtyard, which now had a garden that the children tended, and a second window that Dostra had cut through the stone wall on a weekend when Kale was away. "You could have gone home." "I am home," Alara said. "Earth is home. Earth is where I was born. This is where I chose to be." Mivra was quiet for a long time. She was 12 equivalent years now, no longer the silent girl behind the fence, but not yet the person she was becoming. The lavender of her skin had deepened with age, and her mint-green eyes held a focus that reminded Alara of Seleth. "Nobody chooses this," Mivra said. "I did." "Why?" Alara considered the question. She could have given the easy answer, the one about duty or purpose or the abstract nobility of teaching, but Mivra would have seen through it. She always saw through the easy answers. "Because you put your fingers in my hand," Alara said, "and I understood that if I left, you would learn that every person who promises to stay is lying, and that lesson would be true for the rest of your life, and I would not be the one who taught it." The festival lanterns glowed above them, hung at exactly the right height. Year 8 brought the crisis that nearly ended everything. A new municipal administrator took office, a reformist named Thavos who ran on a platform of fiscal efficiency and infrastructure modernization. The answer at Orphan House, in his analysis, was an inefficient allocation of public resources. The building was valuable real estate. The children could be distributed among existing processing centers in the outer ring. The permanent educator position, an anomaly created by an obscure judicial petition, could be eliminated. Thavos announced the closure in a public memorandum. The children would be dispersed within 30 days. Alara read the memorandum in the courtyard. She read it twice. She folded it and placed it in her pocket, and she did not tell the children. She went to Seleth. The retired judge was 97 now, old even by Tessevry standards, her movements slower, her voice quieter, but her mind as precise as the day she had drafted the Article 14 petition. She read the memorandum and set it down on the table. "He has the authority," she said. "Can we fight it?" "Through the municipal process. No, he holds the majority. The council will not override him." "Then outside the process." Seleth looked at her. "What do you have in mind?" "Everything I've got." Alara called Torin. He was 22 now, a certified structural engineer working for the freight company where he had started as an apprentice. He came the next day, and he brought Pesali, who was studying law at the district academy on a scholarship Seleth had arranged. Pesali brought 2 former Anchuret residents who were working in the port district. They brought 3 more. Fenal came, 15 now, already apprenticing at Dostra's workshop, his gray hands calloused from real work. He stood in the corner of Seleth's garden and said nothing, but his jaw was set in a way that Alara remembered from the loading dock, when he had been 5 years old and asking if tomorrow would be daytime. In 48 hours, 10 former orphans stood in Seleth's courtyard garden, and they were angry. "He wants to close the house," Torin said. His voice was steady, but his hands were fists. "He wants to send the children to processing centers." "We know what processing centers are," Pesali said. "We lived in one." "The walls didn't reach the ceiling," Fenal said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken. Every head turned. "I stopped eating because there were no windows. Alara carried me to the dock so I could see the sky." He looked at the administrator's memorandum on the table. "No." Seleth held up a hand. "The administrator's power comes from the municipal charter. The charter can be amended by public referendum if a sufficient number of registered citizens petition for it." "How many?" Pesali asked. 500. "We can get 500. In 26 days. Pesali looked at Torin. Torin looked at the others. They looked at each other with the expression of people who had grown up in a stone building with a single window, and had learned, from a human teacher who slept on the floor, that one person was enough, and that more than one was unstoppable. "We can get 500, Pesali said again. They got 712. The campaign was not dramatic. It was not a protest or a demonstration or any of the things that make good footage. It was knocking on doors. It was Pesali standing in the marketplace with a clipboard, explaining the Article 14 provision to anyone who would listen. It was Torin walking into businesses where he had built things, walls, foundations, load-bearing structures, and asking the owners to sign. It was Dostra closing her workshop for a day and going door to door in the industrial district. It was Perrin's daughter putting a petition form on the counter of the fruit stall. It was Voss, who could no longer walk to the marketplace, sitting in the classroom and dictating letters to the older children, who hand-delivered them to every address in the district. On the 20th day, Thavos pushed back. He issued a secondary memorandum declaring that the petition threshold was advisory, not binding, and that the closure would proceed on the original timeline. 10 days remained. Seleth read the memorandum. She set it down. She looked at Pesali. "He's wrong," Pesali said. She was 19, a second-year law student, and her voice had the quality of someone who had grown up arguing with stone walls and had learned to win. The Charter's referendum clause uses the word shall, not may. 500 signatures compel a public hearing. He cannot bypass it. "Can you brief it?" "I already have." She pulled a document from her bag, 22 pages, handwritten, with citations that Seleth later said were more precise than most of what she had seen from practicing attorneys. Filed it with the council clerk this morning. Seleth looked at Alara. You taught her to write, she said. I taught her to argue. This is what happens. The council scheduled the hearing for day 25. Thavos, who had expected the petition to dissolve under administrative pressure, found himself facing a chamber full of marketplace vendors, mechanics, retired teachers, and a plumber named Keth who stood in the back with her arms folded and said nothing, which was somehow louder than anything anyone else said. It was Mivra, who was 14 now, who spoke last. She stood in front of the municipal council chambers holding the stack of 712 signed petitions, and she said, in a voice that carried across the chamber with the clarity of someone who had spent years learning to be heard, "You may close a building. You cannot close what was built inside it." The council voted, 5-2. The closure order was overturned. Thavos accepted the result. He did it quietly, in a memorandum that cited council directive, and made no mention of the petitions or the girl who had delivered them. The orphan house remained. Alara found out from Kale, who told her in the corridor outside the classroom with the same flat expression he had worn the day she arrived. "The closure is canceled," he said. "I've heard." He paused. "I filed a report with the exchange recommending your position be made permanent under Tesevry civil service law, not just the Article 14 provision. It would give you residency, benefits, and legal standing independent of the judicial petition." "Why?" Kale looked at her. For the first time in 8 years, his expression was not flat. It was something else, something that lived in the space between duty and the thing that duty had never been able to replace. "Because the building breathes differently when you're in it," he said. He turned and walked away, and Alara stood in the corridor and let the tears come quietly, where nobody could see. Year 11. Seleth Vorn died in the winter. She went quietly in the courtyard garden behind her house, with a clay cup of tea in her hands and the morning sun on her face. She was 108 by Tesevry reckoning. Alara found out from Kale, who told her in the corridor the way he told her everything, directly, without embellishment, leaving room for the weight to arrive on its own. Alara went to the garden. She sat in Seleth's chair and drank tea from Seleth's cup, and allowed herself the luxury of grief, which she had not allowed herself in 11 years, because there had always been too many children who needed her steady. Mivra found her there. The young woman, sat in the second chair and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "She left me her library. All of it, and a note. It says, 'The law is a house. Someone has to live in it or it's just walls.'" They sat in the garden until the sun moved behind the rooftops, and then they went back to the orphanage, because the children were waiting, and the children were always waiting, and that was the job. 3 months later, spring arrived, and with it the news. Mivra was 17 equivalent years, tall for a Tesevry, nearly as tall as Kale, with the deep lavender skin of adulthood and mint green eyes that held the kind of focus that made people pay attention before she spoke. She had completed the District Academy's pre-law program with the highest marks in its history. She had been offered a place at the Central Tesevry Institute of Law, the most prestigious legal academy on the planet, on a full scholarship. She told Alara on a morning in early spring, standing in the courtyard garden, that the children had planted 9 years ago, and that now produced enough vegetables to supplement the orphanage's meals. The festival lanterns from the apartment above the fruit shop, the same ones Perrin had strung across the ceiling that first night, had been rehung in the courtyard, faded but still glowing. "I got in," she said. Alara looked at her. This girl, this young woman, who had once sat behind an iron fence with a half-cake in her pocket, watching a world that had been hung too high for her to reach. "I know," Alara said. "Seleth told me. She was on the admissions panel. She told me she recused herself. She said she didn't need to advocate for me because the work spoke for itself." Mivra paused. "I wish she could have seen this." She did, Alara said. She saw it the day she signed the Article 14 petition. Everything since then was just the proof arriving. Mivra was quiet. She held herself the way she always held herself before saying something important, very still, very focused, as though she were assembling the words with the same precision she would later bring to legal briefs. "I'm going to study child welfare law," she said. Alara nodded. "I'm going to rewrite Article 14. The current provision is a patch, it works, but only because Seleth found the seam. The code needs a proper framework, protection that doesn't depend on finding the one retired judge who cares." "That's a good plan." "It's your plan. You just didn't know it was a plan. You were too busy teaching." Alara laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that lives in the chest and fills a room. Mivra smiled, and it was the same smile that Pesali had given in the classroom 11 years ago, the first smile Alara had seen in the building. The lineage of that smile, passed from a fruit to a girl, to a woman, to a law that would protect children who had not been born yet, was the truest thing Alara had ever built. "I need to tell you something," Mivra said. "Tell me." "When I was small, when you first came, I kept half my food in my pocket, every meal. I wrapped it and saved it because I had learned that meals end, and you cannot trust the next one to come. I remember. I stopped doing that in the 3rd year, not because the meals became reliable, they did, but that wasn't why. I stopped because you were there every morning, every single morning. You were the thing I stopped needing to save food against." She reached into the pocket of her academy coat and pulled out a small object. It was a piece of cloth, faded, worn, the same scrap she had once used to wrap her half-cakes. She had kept it for 11 years. "I don't need this anymore," she said. She placed it in Alara's hand. "But I wanted you to have it, so you would know what you did." Alara held the cloth. It weighed nothing. It weighed everything. "You stayed," Mivra said. "That was the whole thing, you stayed." Alara could not speak. She stood in the courtyard of the Ancharet orphan house, holding a scrap of fabric that a frightened girl had once used to hoard against starvation, and she understood that this was the work. Not the petitions, not the placements, not the curriculum or the legal battles or the nights on the floor. The work was staying. The work was being the person who was there every morning, for so long that a child could stop being afraid. Mivra left for the institute 3 days later. Torin drove her in the same freight vehicle he had once ridden as an uncertain 18-year-old apprentice. Fenal met them at the transit station, grease still on his hands from Dostra's workshop, and handed Mivra a small toolkit he had built himself. "For fixing things," he said. "You never know when the pipes will go." Pesali met them at the academy gates, already a senior student, already arguing cases, already becoming the kind of lawyer who would make administrators nervous. Alara watched them go from the orphanage courtyard. She stood at the fence, the same iron fence, and watched the freight vehicle turn the corner and disappear into the city that had once been a foreign country and was now the only home she knew. Kale appeared beside her. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, which was his version of standing at ease, and he said nothing for a long time. 43, he said finally. "What?" 43 children have passed through this facility during your tenure. 31 have been placed in stable situations, apprenticeships, foster families, academy positions. The highest placement rate of any youth facility in the district. He paused. "I included that in the annual report." "You counted." "I always counted. I simply did not have anything worth reporting until you arrived." He went inside. Alara stayed at the fence for another minute, and then she went inside too, because 21 children remained in her care, some new, some who had been there since the beginning. The garden needed tending. The classroom needed sweeping. Voss was waiting to start the morning lesson, her voice ready, her memory holding more knowledge than the shelves. The festival lanterns glowed in the morning light, hung at exactly the right height, and through the fence, the same iron fence where a lavender girl had once laced her fingers through the bars, Alara could see the city waking up. She went inside to teach. 1 semester, 12 weeks, that had been the promise. Some promises are too small for the people who make them.